Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadan wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam ajma'een. Subhanaka la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana innaka antal alimul hakim wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billahi al-aliyyil azim. Welcome to the Al-Maqasid Khutbah workshop. And the primary intention of this workshop is so that locally here in near Allentown, is that those that will be delivering the khutbah is that they can make sure that they are fulfilling its conditions and its obligations, and that there was interest shown for others to also that benefit, so we decided to live stream it as well. And inshallah ta'ala we will be today focusing on discussing a little bit about Juma itself, and then looking at some of the shurut al-wujub, the conditions of obligatoriness that relate to Juma, as well as the conditions of that validity. And then we will be speaking a little bit about the khutbah itself and its arkan, that is its integrals, and that looking at what would be an example of a valid khutbah, touching as well upon the shurut al-sihha, that is the conditions of validity, and then looking at a few of the sunan, that is the recommended acts. And that next week we will be discussing more of the khutbah itself and topical issues and how to best prepare for an actual sermon itself in terms of its content. But today we'll be focusing more upon the ahkam, that is the legal rulings. For those of you that are following online, and inshallah, that if you want to send an email to Al-Maqasid@almaqasid.org, so that we have your email, we can send you the handout for today, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So let's start with Juma. And Juma is a very, very special day. And in fact, there is a hadith of our Prophet ﷺ that indicates that خَيْرُ يَوْمٍ طَلَعَتْ عَلَيْهِ الشَّمْسُ يَوْمُ الْجُمْعَةِ. The very best day that the sun has shone upon is the day of Juma. And Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala has singled out this day with great fadl, with great merit. And we must look at the day of Juma from the lens of the sacred. And so this applies to the khatib, that is the one who's going to be delivering the sermon, just as this applies really to every believer. And one of the important things about Juma that we really want to inculcate within ourselves, if we're going to be delivering sermons, especially, because that will reflect upon everyone else who attends, and hopefully the entire Muslim community, is that we have to look at Juma from the lens of the sacred. This is a sacred day that Allah has singled out, and there is a requisite adab, an etiquette that we have to have with the sacred, with the special times and places and people that Allah Ta'ala has chosen. There is a special way that we deal with those times, places, and people. And in other words, is that there has to be an increased amount of etiquette, and also that an increased amount of devotion when it comes to Juma. And one of the things that people tend to forget is that Juma is not just Salat al-Juma. Juma is the entire day, beginning the night before when Maghrib enters, and ending the next day when Maghrib enters again. That entire period, that 24-hour period, is Juma. And we're not going to be looking into many of the etiquettes of the day itself. We'll have to save that for another workshop, although that's extremely important. And we'll probably need 3, 4, maybe 5 classes to really look at Juma itself and to really get into depth about the way that we can organize and arrange our day. And that is one of the great signs of Iman, is that we're taking that day seriously. And the one thing that we will say is that Imam al-Haddad mentions is that we should single out Jum'ah for acts of the afterlife. Even though that it's permissible to do other things, it's permissible to work, it's permissible to even have fun. There's all kinds of things that are permissible. But a sign of Iman is that we attempt, to the extent possible, to single out Jum'ah and devote it to the afterlife. If not the entire day, as much as we can of the day. And So in that regard is that the Salaf, the righteous predecessors who came before us, is that they used to prepare for Jum'ah that on Thursday. And so that when it entered, they wouldn't be preoccupied with anything. So that if you needed to get something for the house, or to fix something, or to go to the grocery store, or whatever it might be, wash your clothing or whatever, is that they prepared on Thursday day or before, so that when Maghrib entered, is that they were ready to embrace the nafahat and the sweet breezes of Allah Ta'ala's mercy on Juma. As for the Juma prayer itself, of all of the obligatory prayers, that this is the greatest and most meritorious of all of the obligatory prayers, is the Juma prayer itself. Its congregation, its jama'ah, is the best of all congregations. And it is one of the khususiyat, the special characteristics of the ummah of our Prophet ﷺ that we have been singled out with. And that we all know that there is a special hour on the day of Juma, is that no one will ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for any of the good of this world or the next, except that he or she will be granted what it is that they are seeking. And so Juma is a special day, and it has great merit. And just a little bit about the conditions of obligatoriness for those who will be attending Juma. And this is important, and what we're going to try to restrict ourselves to is what the khatib, the one delivering the sermon, needs to know when they're leading a congregation, is that there are conditions of obligatoriness. And what that means is that these conditions must be fulfilled in order for Jumu'ah to be an obligation upon someone. And the reason it's important for us to know that is because there is a minimum amount of people that is required to that actually have the Jumu'ah be valid. And those people have to have fulfilled these conditions of obligatoriness. And I will preface my comments by saying we're not going to be touching on all 4 schools. That would be too difficult, and it would cause us to be too dispersed in our discussion. So I will be focusing on the presentation from the Shafi school, recognizing very well that there are differences of opinion. I will point out some of the more important differences so that the khatib can be aware of how to act in certain situations. And that in general, the Shafis tend to be a bit stricter in many of the rulings that pertain to especially the actual sermons and the khatib in relation to Juma, so that it pretty much, if you follow the Shafi school, it will be valid on the other schools as well. And although not everything in the Shafi school is that by agreement in the other schools also an obligation, but it's always safe to have a little bit more scrupulousness in these affairs, so that if you do have Shafis in your congregation or those that study this particular school, is that they won't feel uncomfortable because you would have catered to them, just as that in other ways different schools try to cater to that people that follow other schools. And this is considered to be a good thing within reason. And increasingly that our leadership should be aware of some of these issues so that we can explain it to the congregation and to have them have everything they do be based upon knowledge. So the first condition of obligatoriness is that one be a Muslim. And this doesn't mean that you can't have non-Muslims attend your Jummah. And I would say in the United States of America that if you think people are going to benefit from Jummah, that people that are not of our faith, I think that we need to start making our masajid accessible to people that are not from our faith. And my own self, that before I became Muslim, it was one of the more powerful experiences of my life that led me to become Muslim, is that I entered into a mosque in North Oakland in California, and I wasn't Muslim. And they told me that I need to make wudu, and I made wudu, and I attended the sermon, and that prayed with them, and it was very impactful. It was one of the things that eventually made me become Muslim. And I think that this is something that is important, is and one of the things that I that was impressed with by this mosque is that they had chairs for non-Muslims to come attend. And that they actually set chairs up for people to come attend and to benefit, from the sermon. And that's a very beautiful thing. And that the only condition of that would be as long as you feel that it's not going to cause fitna of some sort. But in general, that I think this is a really good thing, and we should be very open to this. But for for it to be an obligation upon someone has to be a Muslim. Okay? That secondly, that one have reached puberty. That is that they're legally responsible. And so, even though that a child could attend Juma, and that their Juma would be valid if they fulfilled its conditions after they've reached the age of discrimination, and they perform their wudu and so forth, and they would get reward for it, and likewise the parents who brought them, is that they wouldn't be considered that from among those people that are needed, that necessary number for Juma. Okay? But it is a good thing, and I'm going to point out some of these etiquettes, is that one of the things in a traditional society, I know there's ikhtilaf amongst the ulama about what age kids should come to the masjid and so forth. And one of the things that I noticed about traditional children, and I say this having lived in a society where that I've seen traditional children that come to the mosque with their parents, and sometimes they would be right around that age of discrimination, is that they tended to not be as fidgety as the children in our culture, is that they would sit next to their father and they would actually listen and pay attention, right, to the khutbah. And that is more difficult in our society where our kids are exposed to sensory overload and it affects their attention spans and so forth. But that I do think that we need to have tolerance with children so that we can create an environment, as long as they're not disrupting what is taking place, we should encourage them to come within reason and make arrangements that if people tend to have children that don't tend to sit like what was mentioned, we should make arrangements, right, in our prayer spaces, in our mosques, that for them to still be there and so that their parents can still take part. And I think that where the context of the United States of America, where we are and wherever else anyone else is tuning in from, is that Juma is a very important opportunity that happens on a weekly basis. And that much of what people got previously in traditional societies, that they're simply not getting nowadays. And so that we really need to go out of our way to provide an experience for people on Juma that can really benefit them greatly and make them feel very comfortable, and that be a means to help people's hearts be attached to the mosque or to the prayer space. This is a beautiful thing and an important thing. And we have a number of examples of that, things that would be considered to be good innovations that we can do. And there's much historical precedence for this in many places in the Muslim world to help create that experience. And that things like providing food after, things like having some type of public invocation either before or after, or something of that nature. These are all good things. And that there are a number of other examples that could be mentioned in that regard. But it is a condition of obligatoriness is that one have reached puberty in order to count that for it to be an obligation upon them. The third is that one have intellect. So someone that is unconscious or someone that is legally insane, it is not an obligation upon them to pray Salat al-Jum'ah. The fourth is that one be male. And so it is not an obligation upon females. Although that if they do attend, that it suffices them for Salat al-Dhuhr. So it's that valid as long as they fulfill the other conditions and there's no other preventative measures. And then fifthly is that one have good health. If someone is ill, such that it would impose a hardship upon them were they to attend. And this doesn't just mean that someone has a little scratch on their arm or someone is just slightly tired or that someone just has a very minor headache. It has to be something that it's yashuk alayhim, it's difficult for them to attend. And to have some type of condition, something like diarrhea or something of that sort, or a very serious headache, or that they have a very high fever and a severe cold, something like this, or let alone anything more severe than that Juma is not an obligation upon them. Okay? And so health is one of the conditions of obligatoriness. And then that one be a resident. And there might be some difference on this in other schools, but in the Shafi school is that Juma is not an obligation upon a traveler. And a traveler is defined as someone who is not in a place for more than that 4 days, not including the day of entry and exit. Anything less than that, they're considered to be a traveler. So a traveler in the Shafi school is that if you go to a particular place, and let's say that you arrive on Monday, and you're staying Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then you're leaving on Friday. Okay, or let's just actually bump it up a day so that we can include Friday. Let's say this one arrives Tuesday, they stay Tuesday, they stay Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and they're leaving on Saturday. Okay, so they arrived on Tuesday, so that day doesn't count. They're leaving on Saturday, so that day doesn't count. How many days are they staying in that place? 3. Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. So that person is considered to be a traveler. Even if they're not actually traveling on the day of Juma, they're still considered to be a traveler, and it's not an obligation upon them to pray Juma. But were they to pray Juma, is that they would get reward for it, and it would suffice them for Salat al-Dhuhr. Okay? And so, let alone if it's less than that, and that if they would say, for instance, arrive on Tuesday, stay Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and leave on Sunday, then they would be there for 4 days. And it would be an obligation upon them to pray Juma in that situation, even if they don't live in that place full time. So if that someone lives in, let's say, that Baltimore, Maryland, that they come to visit us here, and they plan to stay a week with us, that in addition to the day of that arrival and leaving, is that if they were here, it would be an obligation upon them that to pray Salatul Juma. If they were in the distance, that they would hear the adhan, that is the call to prayer. And then that there is a difference between what is known as a muqim and a mustawtan. And you could roughly say one is a part-time resident and one is a full-time resident. And when it comes to the number of people for Jum'ah, this is one of the conditions in the Shafi school, is that that person be mustawtan. That is, that they be a full-time resident, meaning that they live there and they don't leave except when they need to. Okay? And so that in the Shafi school, there's a differentiation between the muqim and the mustawtan, the part-time and the full-time resident. But again, that for the muqim, the part-time resident, Jum'ah is an obligation upon them to pray. Okay? And that for the mustawtan, is that it's not only an obligation for them to pray, but also that they are the ones whereby which now that you count the actual number of people who are there for Salatul Jum'ah. Okay? And that anyone other than a mustawtan, a full-time resident, are not counted in the overall number in the Shafi school. And so that if, let's say that you were putting on a retreat or something, and there were 100 people there, right, for Jum'ah, and let's say that all of them were travelers, it's permissible, even as being the khatib, you can be a traveler and still deliver the Jum'ah. And that as a traveler, you can still pray Jum'ah, and it will be valid. But it's just not an obligation upon you. So I hope those differences are clear. And then that we can talk about the shurut al-sihha, the conditions of validity that of Salatul Jum'ah. And again, you will see how this relates to the knowledge that the khatib must know. Is that the Jum'ah is part of the reason that it gets its name Jum'ah is lijtima' an-nas, because people are that congregating, they're coming together. And so one of the obvious that conditions of validity is that it be performed in a congregation. Okay, so there has to be that a congregation established. And secondly, that it take place during the time of the noon prayer. Okay, so that in all three schools, that other than the Hanbali school, that Juma has to take place in the Dhuhr time, from the beginning of Dhuhr up until Asr. And it can take place that at the very beginning of the time. You could, that in terms of that permissibility, postpone it to the very end of the time, as long as you finish that the prayer before that Asr enters. So, for instance, we made the decision here locally, and that to keep the same time of Juma all year round, so that the people that are attending can come, know the time, and know all throughout the year that it's not going to change. Yes, in the summer, it's going to be much closer to the very beginning time. And in the winter, like now, is that it's going to be towards the middle of the time. And in the, the winter solstice, that there's not going to be that much time from the time the prayer ends until the time the Asr enters. It doesn't affect the validity whatsoever as long as it's within that time of Dhuhr. And then it's up to the leadership of the local mosque or place that people are praying to decide what's in the best interest of the people. And there is an opinion in the Hanbali school, is that Juma can actually be prayed before the entrance of Dhuhr, and that's the Hanbali opinion. And so someone might have been involved in a community where they actually start the khutbah before Salat al-Dhuhr enters, and then they actually pray after that the Dhuhr enters. And we'd have to do tahqiq of the Hanbali opinion and so forth. We shouldn't really do that unless there's really a need to do so. And that then we have to define what that need really is. In these things, it's always better to be scrupulous. Yes, the Sharia is there and it's expansive in its nature when there's a need. If there really is a need for whatever reason, then we can comfortably take that Hanbali opinion. But it's something we should try to avoid if possible to make sure that our ibadah is acceptable, that according to the different schools. And in that some places you find is that they actually have multiple Jumas, because that they have limits on the amount of people that can actually be in the building at a particular time, and they're to capacity. And then people have to come the prayer after, and then the prayer after. And having that asked about this, is that this would be similar to that having multiple Jumas for a need. That in the Shafi school, you actually can't have multiple Jumas, even at the same time, in different places in the same city if there's no need. I'm not sure about the position in other schools about that. However, if there's a need, it's fine to have multiple Jumas according to the need. And if there is a need in terms of one particular place where you simply can't fit everyone in the building at one particular time, then it would seem that it would relate to that, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. And that it follow 2 sermons, and so that the Juma prayer that actually follow that 2 sermons. Okay, that's the next condition of validity. And then that its site be located among the dwellings of the community. In the Shafi school, this is a condition. And so you can't go outside of city limits. So let's say that you lived in a city. A lot of times people now that live in larger cities or in sprawling suburbs that, let's say, live in northern Philadelphia, and it's just kind of all connected from that central Philadelphia way up into the sprawling suburb, that is considered to be, in this case, one city. But let's say that someone just lives in a smaller city where there's not surrounding cities around. In that particular case, is that you don't go outside of the city limits. You can't, in fact, and pray kind of in the countryside. That it has to be done among the dwellings of the community. And that it doesn't have to be in a masjid. Right? It doesn't have to be in a masjid. That it has to be in a place within the dwellings of the community. Okay? And so that it could be in a university, in a hall that they give. It could be in a musalla, in a prayer hall. Or it can obviously be in a masjid, but it doesn't have to be. Okay? and the criterion in the Shafi school is that it is in a place that is not permissible that to shorten the prayer for a traveler. In other words, that it has to be inside the city walls or where there still are dwellings and buildings. And then the next condition of validity is that there be a minimum of 40 participants who fulfill the conditions of obligatoriness. This is the Shafi school. Okay? And here that we'll mention the Maliki opinion and the Hanafi opinion. What I understand in the Hanafi school is that there's two opinions. The opinion of Abu Hanifa is that there have to be 3 people, including the Imam, and of the Sahibain is that it's that 3, and in addition to the Imam, so a total of 4. Okay, and so that there's plenty of room within the Hanafi school for smaller congregations, and then the Maliki opinion is 12, and so that I believe we have to do what's best for the community. And if we're in a place where that there's less than 40, if you want to pray and take one of the other opinions and out of scrupulousness, make up your prayer, make as a salat al-dhuhr, that is up to someone. But there's opinions there that can cover us in that. In particular, the Hanafi opinion, which is the most lenient in this case. And I've actually been to a place in New Mexico where there's a masjid there, and their regular congregation was 3 people. There was very few. Those were the regulars were only 3, and I remember that one time being there for Juma, and I think that day when I was there was 4. But I was just thinking about the blessing of the Sharia, is that really like these were regularly, is that the people that were there were only 3. Right, so alhamdulillah. So those are some of the conditions of validity, and I think that's pretty straightforward up until now. Is there any questions on any of that up until now?
Does the Imam count as one of the 12, 3, or 40?
Yes, in the Shafi school, that 40 with the Imam. No. Okay, so let's move on now because we have quite a bit to cover. And now we're going to move on to actually discussing the khutbah itself. And so we've talked a little bit about the merit of Juma and the congregation and the conditions of obligatoriness and then of validity of the prayer itself. But now we're going to hone in more now on the sermon itself. And obviously that you're going to be having a khatib who is delivering that khutbah. And in the Shafi school is that there are integrals, there are arkan, there are obligatory measures that have to be there in order for the khutbah to be valid. And that of the 4 schools, that the Shafis are the strictest. And some of the other schools, like the Hanafi school, is that they're much more lenient in terms of what is considered to be a khutbah. And so if you fulfill these, which are very easy to fulfill, and usually that even someone who's a part of the Hanafi school will fulfill these anyway, but it's important here that if we follow this roadmap, is that nakhruj min al-khilaf, that we will get out of any difference of opinion, and that again, that the more that we can be scrupulous and have our worship in general, but especially when we're coming together in a congregation, be acceptable on that all of the different opinions of the scholars, the better. So there are 5 integrals in the Shafi school, and they're very easy and very straightforward if you have them here before you. The first is that saying Alhamdulillah in both sermons, okay? And that this particular utterance is an obligation. It has to be that the word hamd has to be used, okay? Or a derivation of it, so that you can have it in noun form, just as you could have it in that verb form as well, okay? So that you could say that ahmaduhu or nahmaduhu, okay? Or you could say alhamdulillah. It has to be that something derived from hamd. Okay? And it's an obligation that you say Alhamdulillah in both sermons. And oftentimes when we begin that our talks or our presentations, it's recommended to begin with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. However, because the sunnah of our Prophet ﷺ that was, he began his khutbah with Alhamdulillah. In this instance, is that we give precedence to the sunnah. Our Prophet began this way, and this is how we began. And it's recommended to do so, to begin that way, and it's an obligation that we have some form of hamd in both sermons. Okay? And then secondly, the second integral is sending blessings upon the Prophet ﷺ in both sermons. So, as-salatu ala nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam. This is also an obligatory utterance. And it does not suffice to say, Rahimahullah Muhammadan. May Allah have mercy on Muhammad. It has to be that as-salat, or in verb form, sallallahu alayhi wasallam wa alih. Likewise, is that we have to actually mention the Prophet. So we can't just say sallallahu alayhi. Okay? We have to mention the Prophet Muhammad or the Nabi or Rasulullah. Okay? And this likewise has to be done in both sermons. The third integral is enjoining taqwa. Enjoining taqwa in both sermons. And that, again, that there are different ways to do this. Now, this slightly differs from the first two integrals in that there is not a particular expression that is obligatory for this. Okay, so that what you have to do is encourage obedience or warn of disobedience. Encourage obedience or warn disobedience. So you could say to someone that obey Allah, or you could say that fear, beware of the punishment of Allah, and that would suffice. But as we will see, that all of the integrals have to be in Arabic, and we'll come back to that. When we talk about the integrals, they have to be in Arabic. Now, we can repeat them if we want in English, if we find that that's effective and that's our style on how we speak. That's fine. You can repeat them after. And that gets back to the individual's choice on how they choose to deliver the sermon. But they have to be recited in Arabic. Okay? So that you could say like, Ati Allah, right? Or Ihdharu in Iqab Allah. Something of that nature. And this is an obligation as well in both sermons. And as we will come back to it, but we'll mention it now, and it's good to repeat for clarity and so that this knowledge sticks in our mind, is that it's recommended to do it in this order. Okay, so that we say Alhamdulillah wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillah, and you can add that a rhyming prose if you want, as many eloquent speakers do, but you have it in that order: hamd, salawat, and then enjoining taqwa. That's recommended to do. Even though if you did it outside of that order, it would still count in terms of the fulfilling the obligations. And then the fourth integral is reciting one verse of the Quran in one of the two sermons. So you have to recite that what is called an ayah mufhima, that a verse that conveys an intended meaning. Okay? And there's difference of opinion in the Shafi school. Does it have to be a complete verse, or can it be part of a verse? And so the fact that there's difference of opinion means is that it's permissible to follow both positions. Both positions are followable. The key is that we choose a verse that has an intended meaning, that it either is a promise, it's a threat, or an exhortation, or something of that nature. Okay? That the verse that we choose, there has to be one that conveys an intended meaning. Now, an important point here is that let's say that you quote a verse of the Quran that has a mention of taqwa in it, and you're intending by that to fulfill the third integral is that you can't have it for both integrals. So if you want, you have to quote another verse in order to fulfill this integral. Okay? And it is recommended, though, it is better, you could say rather, it is better that one recite this verse in the first sermon. Although if someone did it in the second, that is perfectly fine. And then the fifth integral is that one supplicate for the believers in the second sermon. Okay, so this differs from the previous integral, which can be in either one of the two sermons. The supplication for the believers has to be in the second sermon. It's an obligation. And it must be for their hereafter. So it's not enough to say that, oh Allah, bless this congregation with wealth. Bless this congregation with nice houses in the suburbs. Bless this that's not sufficient, right? It's permissible to make du'as for worldly things for people, but it doesn't fulfill the obligation, right? So we have to make that some type of supplication that's of something related to the afterlife. That Allah Ta'ala forgive the male and female believers. That Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala that give us tawfiq in all of our different affairs and allow us to be successful in both worlds and so forth. That there be some type of supplication that pertains to our afterlife. Tamam? Okay, so it's as simple as that. Those are the 5 obligations, and that it shows you that technically speaking is that you could deliver a sermon in a very, very short period of time. If you just stood up, said the integrals, sat down, which is coming, which is one of the conditions that's coming between the two, fulfilled the other conditions of validity, which are coming, which are still fairly easy, you could do a khutbah very, very quickly. Okay, and the integrals are fairly easy, to fulfill. I took this from the Reliance of the Traveler of Sheikh Noor, where it says here, the following sermon, which has been related by 2 chains of transmission, one ascribing it to Ibn Mas'ud and the other through him to the Prophet ﷺ, fulfills the first 4 of the above mentioned integrals. And if someone wanted to, that they could just, for instance, just memorize this and have this be their staple part of the khutbah that they recite to fulfill the integrals, and then intersperse this in what they'll be saying in the second khutbah as well, that with wa'ath, with some type of admonition in English, for instance. And so, إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن سيدنا محمد عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا. And so it's very easy for us to see how the integrals are fulfilled here. So the first, saying Alhamdulillah, that 2 times here, Inna Alhamdulillah, or Nahmaduhu wa nasta'inu wa nastaghfiruh. One of those would have sufficed, but in this khutbah here we have 2. And then blessings upon the Prophet. After he said here, وَاشْهَدُ أَنَّ سَيِّدِنَا مُحَمَّدًا عَبْدُهُ وَرَسُولُهُ, which is not the salawat. But then after that, sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Okay, so there's salawat mentioned after it. Okay, and then the wasiyah bit taqwa. So the first verse, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا اتَّقُوا اللَّهَ حَقَّ تُقَاتِهِ. So here it's in verbal form in the command, ittaqullah, have taqwa of Allah. Okay. And then the second verse is an ayah mufhima. There's no doubt that it's a verse that has an intended meaning. Ya ayyuhan nas ittaqu rabbakum, till the end of the verse. Okay, so that fulfills the first 4 conditions and integrals rather. And again, is that if you've ever heard an eloquent speaker in Arabic speak is that oftentimes they will intersperse these integrals with rhyming prose and different ways of glorifying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and different ways of invoking blessings upon the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and various ways of praising Allah and so forth. And that's all fine, and that it's actually recommended, as we will see, when it comes to the khutbah. And I included the translation there for those that wanted to, that also know the meaning. And then, after saying the above mentioned and sitting briefly, the khatib would then rise and again say Alhamdulillah, send blessings upon the Prophet ﷺ, and enjoin the congregation to taqwa. Oh, there should be of there. To taqwa of Allah. Okay? And again, because we said it has to be done in both sermons. Okay? Then he would add a supplication for the Muslims, such as Allahumma ghfir lil mu'mineen wal mu'minat. Oh Allah, forgive the male and female believers. If that's all one said, that would suffice. And all of the integrals must be in Arabic. However, the rest of the sermon may be in any language, as it does not harm for the integrals to be interspersed with an admonition, a wa'adh. And that even if that be in a different language, and we've checked this with our teachers in relation to this, and this is one of the more contentious points for some of the other schools, like the Hanafi school, which doesn't permit any of the khutbah in any other language. That's correct, right, Sayyid Hassan? There's some tafsil about that? Okay, that was my understanding. Maybe there's some room there with a more expanded understanding. But nevertheless, this is something clearly permissible in the Shafi school, and that would require a little bit more effort, that we examine that according to the other schools, whether it be the Hanafis, as based upon my understanding of it, or that even the Maliki or other schools. And that there are some who prefer to do a wa'adh, like just some type of admonition or regular talk, and then to have the khutbah be entirely in Arabic. And there's no doubt that that's fine to do, and that's been a practice that's been done in the Muslim world for probably centuries. My personal preference doesn't really matter, because who am I to say this? But I tend to, that personally, for what it's worth, prefer it to be combined in one, because there's something about the khutbah being in the language of the people that understands, when you understand the overarching purpose of the khutbah and what it's supposed to do in relation to the one listening, and the difference between it being included with these integrals and then someone standing when they're speaking, and the nature of the day of Juma and so forth. I prefer that personally, that it be done in this particular way, that you do the integrals in Arabic, and then you do the admonition as part of that same khutbah in English. My personal experience is, for what it's worth, is that it's more effective. While I totally respect the difference of opinion of the ulama in this matter, and those who choose to do otherwise, that here where we are, this is what we practice. So again, that's all very straightforward. Much of that probably many people knew, but again, it's about solidifying these foundations, and that we want to do everything based upon knowledge. We're reading today in the book of Imam al-Sha'rani, the Uhud al-Muhammadiyah, where one of the things that he said is that it's not sufficient when we worship Allah Ta'ala that we just do what everyone else is doing. And what is meant here is that by the common folk, is that we have to have knowledge. We have to have knowledge that in terms of what we're doing, and intend to do what we're doing in the religious sense. And that one of the proofs of this is that he says is that when Munkar and Nakir, and they come and they ask us the questions that will be asked in the grave, is that there will be people who will waver when they're asked those questions, and they will say, is that I heard other people saying it, so I said it. And he was using this as a proof that if we build our worship just based upon what everyone else is doing without really having authentic knowledge behind it, is that it's likely that that is not going to be accepted and it's going to be invalid. So it's very important that even though these foundations appear to be simple, is that if it's really going to be effective, is that it be solid in terms of the knowledge base. And then next week when we'll focus on that more in terms of the content of it and that ways to be effective as speakers. And there's many books, even in English, that are not written by Muslims that can help in that regard, as we will talk about next week, bi'ithnillahi ta'ala. So let's look at some of the conditions of validity. And again, these are the conditions of validity of the two sermons. The first is that the khatib be a male. And it is an obligation that the one delivering the sermon be a male. Second, that he be in a state of purity. And what is meant here, that he be free of minor and major ritual impurity. Okay, that he be both having taken a ghusl if he had fallen into a state of greater ritual impurity, and that he be in a state of wudu if he fell out of that he had made wudu if he would have fallen into a state of minor ritual impurity. And what does someone do though, la qadar Allah, if they would break their wudu when they're delivering the sermon? He has one of two choices. Either that he just excuses himself and that goes to make wudu and comes back and starts the khutbah over. If you have to go and perform the wudu, you have to start the khutbah over. And that if you want, at that point, just do it very short and then lead the prayer, that's fine. And in these matters, as incredibly embarrassing as that might be, is that there's no haya and deen. If that happens to someone, that you can't just fake it and lead the prayer, right? That's haram and very dangerous to embark upon something like that when you really don't have wudu. And it is possible that you somehow disguise it. And some of the scholars used to mention is that if someone's in the congregation, this is mentioned in the books of Shafi fiqh, if someone's in the congregation and they break their wudu, is that it's permissible for them to put their hand over their nose as if they have a bloody nose or something, and then excuse themselves, make wudu, and to come back. And so that if you want to disguise it in some way, that's perfectly fine. And so if you excuse yourself, perform wudu, and then come back, you'd have to start over. The second thing that you can do is what is called istikhlaf, is that you can appoint someone else to take over. Okay, so that if someone's delivering the sermon, qadar Allah, that broke their wudu, then if someone could look at someone in the front row or wherever they might be, and that ask them to take over from where they built off. And so that if someone had already done, let's say they're in the first sermon, had done the arkan, is that person could pick up where they left off and just take his place, and then finish the first part of the sermon, and then have to fulfill the integrals in the integrals in the second sermon, and then lead the prayer. And that would be perfectly fine, and you wouldn't have to start from the beginning in that case. The one condition there is that the person who is taking over, he had heard the integrals. So it has to be someone there who's there from the beginning. Okay. The next condition of validity is that his clothes, body, and place he is standing be free from impurities. And that's a relatively obvious one, just like prayer, is that someone be free of impurities. And then that his legal nakedness, his aura, be covered. And so just as prayer is that you have to be clothed appropriately. And it is a good practice in relation to clothing for Jum'ah, especially for the khatib, to wear some form of Islamic clothing, to have a robe or something of that nature that you put on, or like a jubba or something like that. That is a good thing. And even if it means that normally you don't dress like that, is that there's nothing wrong with that, especially dressing like that for Juma, even as an attendee, right? Or let alone that if you're the khatib. That is actually a good thing to do. And so that one shouldn't think that, oh, I'm not dressing like that normally, so I'm not going to dress like that, on Juma. This is a good thing, and it's actually a sign of ihtiram and respect of that Juma. Okay? And then that it is a condition that he be standing during them. Okay, and this is specific. This is the Shafi opinion, is that it's an obligation for him if he can to stand, and obviously that it's more effective that if the speaker is standing, that and if he's unable to stand for whatever reason, that it is permissible for him to sit, right? And if he's unable to sit, it's permissible for him to lie down. But it's better in this situation that someone else is appointed to deliver the khutbah. Okay. It's also a condition of validity that he sit down between the two sermons, so that the first one is differentiated from the second. And then the obligatory minimum for him when sitting is more than the time than the tuma'nina to salat, which is subhanallah, for a brief moment. So you have to at least sit longer than the time that it takes to say subhanallah. So you sit down for a brief moment, and then you can stand right back up. But it's recommended to sit for the amount of time that it takes to recite Surah Al-Ikhlas. Okay, so you finish the first sermon, you sit down, the time that it takes to recite Surah Al-Ikhlas, and then you stand up. And it's also a condition in the Shafi school that there be continuity, what's known as muwala, between the two sermons. And this is urfan, customarily. And so there can't be a big gap between the first sermon and the second sermon. Some scholars have said is that this is the time that it takes to pray 2 light rak'ahs. So for whatever reason, that let's say the sound system went off and someone just waited for whatever reason, and waited such a long period of time that several minutes passed, 5, 6, 7 minutes passed, then you'd have to start over. And so the time that it takes to pray 2 light rak'ahs is what they mentioned, that if it goes longer than that, or customarily if it's considered to be too long, then you have to start over. And so they need to be that one right after the other. In other words, there needs to be continuity. And there also needs to be continuity between the second khutbah and the prayer. And sometimes people take way too long between the khutbah and the prayer. And I'm not sure about the other schools about that. Do you know the Hanafi opinion on that? Okay. We can look into that. Unfortunately, that's one of the opinions I should have checked the other schools on. Inshallah, we can look into that, bi'idhnillah. But in the Shafi school, it has to be performed that immediately after, and that it has to be within that period again of 2 light rak'ahs. And so that if there's a need for whatever reason to make sure that everyone's lined up in rows and so forth, all of that has to be done that fairly quickly. And then but I've seen people that really wait a long period of time. And some of the things that they do are unnecessary, and then start. You take make sure everyone's lines are straight, convey the message that needs to be conveyed, and then proceed directly to the prayer. Okay? And that his voice be loud enough for the 40 required participants, or whatever opinion we're following, to hear the sermon's integrals. Okay? And some of them mention this as a condition, then also say that the 40 people actually have to hear the integrals. But one is kind of understood with the other. Okay? And as we've already mentioned, that the integrals be in Arabic. And then finally, as we've already mentioned as well, that the 2 sermons occur during the noon prayers time, dhuhr. And I do think it's a good idea. There are people that follow prayer calendars, and that Juma enters at 12:37, right? Right at 12:37, they start. It's good to wait a few minutes because prayer calendars differ. And if someone's calling the adhan right at that time, I would wait like a minute or two to call the adhan. It takes a couple minutes to call the adhan. You've waited 3 or 4 minutes, khalas, that's enough. But be slightly scrupulous when it comes to that. And that comes up as well when in terms of iftars. There are people that, some of the prayer, one says 6:37, the other one says 6:35, the other one says 6:38. And there are people that are following the 6:35 time, And it might be a big city that has different elevations, even at type of time 6:35, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Inshallah, we hope the fast is still accepted, but why take the chance? The sunnah is to hasten to break your fast after you're certain, right? And that you want to have certainty, and it's better to wait, 2 or 3 minutes. 3 is probably best. And then call the adhan, khalas, then you can break your fast. So these types of things, it's good to be a bit scrupulous in relation to them. Okay, so those are the conditions of validity. Again, straightforward. Are there any questions on that? Mm-hmm.
So just back to that he be in a state of purity.
Mm-hmm.
So as you mentioned, he could, if he broke his wudu, and then he appointed someone, and then they took over, and he met all the valid points that he heard, everything. If the imam at the time went, refreshed his wudu, came back, could then he get reappointed?
No, the person who was appointed then is now
Khalas.
taken over. Khalas. Yeah. And the scholars differ about can the imam be different than the khatib? In the Shafi opinion, it's permissible, and I believe in a couple of the other schools it's impermissible. Right? So there's room in the Shafi madhab for that, but that what has come to us from the early people is that the khatib is the imam, but it's in the Shafi school that's permissible. So there's ikhtilaf amongst the ulama in relation to that point, and that again it's one of those matters that there's a difference on. Okay, so let's now look at the recommended acts. And it is recommended that he say, that is the khatib, Assalamu alaikum, that at 2 different times. When he enters into the mosque, and then when he ascends the pulpit. And I believe that in a couple other schools outside the Shafi schools, it's actually makruh to send salams that at the beginning of the khutbah. So again, there's difference of opinion there. This is the Shafi opinion, that one says Assalamu alaikum when entering into the masjid or the prayer space, wherever they're praying, and then that when he also that ascends the pulpit. And that he sit until the mu'adhin has finished the adhan. And what is meant here is the second adhan. So that there is that first call to prayer, and then the imam enters. And in the Shafi school, if the imam is going to go directly up to the pulpit, he doesn't pray Tahiyyat al-Masjid, the greeting prayer of the mosque. He goes immediately up to the minbar, the pulpit, and then once he stands, says salams, and then sits down, then the mu'adhin is going to call the adhan, and then he's going to stand up right after that and to begin the khutbah. It is also recommended that the khatib stand on a pulpit. And it is permissible to just stand on the ground, but it is recommended that he stand on a pulpit. We're intending, inshallah, here to build one. We can have a general idea of the design, and even someone who said that if we find a woodworker, they would purchase it, but it's just a matter of getting that woodworker to build it, inshallah ta'ala, and then to begin. That our Prophet began, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, on a tree stump that then turned into a pulpit that someone had made. And we all know the beautiful story about how that tree stump, which was a pulpit, how much it longed for our Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. If that can happen to a tree stump just by touching the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam and being close to him, ya Allah, what about a believer whose heart can have ma'rifah? What would happen to a believer that if we attach ourselves and touch the Prophet ﷺ in that sense? So that it's recommended that the khatib stand on a pulpit or some type of high place. Okay? And it is recommended though that the pulpit be on the right side of the prayer niche. Okay? And that if for some reason it's not possible to do that, it's permissible for it to be on the left side, but it's recommended that it be on the right side. It's also recommended that the khatib lean on a staff with his left hand that while he's speaking. Okay, so that's a recommended measure. And oftentimes people will have staffs that they leave near the pulpit for Salat al-Jumu'ah. This is recommended. And then what he'll do is, if there's a place to do it, he'll put his right hand on the pulpit. So that was the sunnah, is to left hand the staff and then right hand that on the pulpit. It's also recommended that he face the congregation that during both of the sermons. And as is previously mentioned, that he say the above mentioned integrals in order. And then it's recommended that the khutbah be three things: eloquent, intelligible, and concise. And so we should really be appointing the people that can speak eloquently. And there's degrees of eloquence, right? But it's important, and this is the sunnah of our Prophet ﷺ, is that you put forth the people that speak the best. And this is from his sunnah. And one of the great examples of that is Sayyidina Ja'far, is that when he spoke in front of the Abyssinian king, he was the most eloquent and he had the most knowledge, and look what he was able to do. And this is something that oftentimes is neglected in our communities, and that we respect all people, and we don't harbor ill feelings in our heart for anyone, whether they can speak the native language of the people well or with or without an accent. I mean, that we got to get beyond that, and that we should never make fun of anyone's accents ever, and we should never let our children do that. That's wrong, and that we should never do that, period, no matter what culture it is. And that it's not aib at all that for someone that be slightly deficient in relation to that learning a language of the local people. Yes, it's a good thing to do, but there are a lot of people that grew up 30, 40 years outside of the country that they moved to, and then that they might always speak the language in a broken fashion. And that's natural if you look at when and how languages are learned. That's something you would expect, especially if the people are older. But we would differentiate between that and between the people that we put forward that to speak in front of other people. And the people that we should encourage to give the khutbah should be the more eloquent of the people that have that better oratory skills. And that a lot of it really requires practice. And one of the things that they used to do in Tarim, where the Fakir studied, is that from the very beginning, that Habib Omar would call upon people to speak, and without them knowing. And you can't say no to Habib, and you don't do that. You know, you have to get up and speak, and you have to do the best that you can. And you know, sometimes at first you're nervous and your palms sweat and this and that, and you're jittery, and you know, you just kind of are all over the place or don't really know what to say and that type of thing. But a lot of it comes with practice. And then you have people that are just very good at speaking, at public speaking. They just have good oratory skills. And that most people can be at a decent level through practice. And then you always have people that excel, like anything else in life. And so a lot of it really is practice, is getting ourselves used to public speaking and so forth. And one of the good things to do is that to listen to the recordings, especially in the early days. Not so that you can be impressed with yourself and, oh wow, look what I said, right? But to get better, and to learn about the mistakes that you made. And sometimes you have idiosyncrasies that you don't even realize. And a lot of us have that, and I include my own self. Like you just say that a lot. Or I remember I had a habit when I first came back from the Muslim world, saying yani. And I remember it was a funny story. I went one time with Sidi Osama Khan when he was working as a chaplain in the Tracy prison. I went in to meet some of the brothers there. And I got along well with one of these brothers. And he came up to Osama after. He said, man, that brother, yeah, it was a cool brother, but he said, who's Yani? Because I guess I kept saying Yani as a kind of like filler word. I don't know if I still do that or not. Do I? Oh, you shook your head, yes. You shook your head. but we all kind of have filler words. We might stutter or this or that. And people that have good oratory skills, you'll see that they don't tend to do that. So, we work with what we have, and all of us are going to be deficient in some way. There's no doubt about that. But to try to work on that, because at first you might not realize it. And when you listen to yourself, and oftentimes when we do listen to ourselves, you're like, oh my God, forget that, I'm never standing up in public again. But that's actually a good thing, right? Because then that if you want to stand up before people, you really shouldn't. That if you don't want to stand up before people, then you probably should. And so that's something that's important when it comes to that. So that it be eloquent. And we need to put forward the right people and try to work on our vocabularies. And a lot of that comes from that reading. Some of even what our Western shuyukh have a regular wird of reading English works to strengthen their English vocabularies. And that's a good thing to do with the right intention. And it also has to be intelligible or understandable, is that you want to speak in a way that people can understand. And a lot of this we're going to get into next time in terms of content and so forth. But we want it to be intelligible. We want it to be a combination of a number of different things all in one. And again, we'll come to that what are these components of the khutbah, and how we can try to cater to a number of different matters all at once in order to fulfill the needs of the diverse people that are in the congregation. And also being concise. It's recommended to be concise. And some scholars that do point to the fact that this depends on the circumstances. And sometimes if that you're in a circumstance where there is that one of the only weekly exposures that people have, and as long as that you're not too long-winded and that preventing people from things that they have to do, is that this is considered to be a good thing. What is meant by concise here is that you give a lot of knowledge but in a few words. You're brief but comprehensive. Okay, that's what we really mean by concise. And I do have to say one of the most annoying things of all is that if you're in a khutbah and you see people looking at their watches, there's no doubt that just like that is very difficult to keep going on if people are looking up at the clock and so forth. But having said that, it is important that we take into consideration people's schedules. And especially in a place like the United States of America, people have a very limited time. Some of them might only have an hour off, and they had a 10 or 15 minute commute, and they got to get back to work, and they also have to fit lunch in and things like that. So we should respect that people's time. And it's always good to ask if you're delivering a khutbah in another place, okay, what time do we start? And what time should I finish the khutbah, and what time should I finish the prayer? It's very easy that once you get in a flow and words are coming, just to keep going. And even though we all sometimes make that mistake, we have to strive to keep it to the time limit. And so that we finish the prayer on time, and people can get back to their needs. And short and sweet is best, as it is said that خَيْرُ الْكَلَامَ مَا قَلَّ وَدَلَّ. Right, the best of that sermons or the best of speech is that which is the most concise, but is the most informative. So that's a very important point. And then that the khatib in the second khutbah, by saying Astaghfirullah li wa lakum, where he's essentially seeking forgiveness for his own self and for those present, and then that he commenced the prayer without delay. So immediately after the second khutbah, that the aqama is called, the call to commence, and then he starts the prayer, and then that he read audibly Surah Juma and Al-Munafiqeen. This is the Shafi school. In some schools they don't specify specific chapters of the Quran, or if not those two surahs, Surah Al-A'la wal-Ghashiyah, and Surah Al-Ghashiyah. That's recommended in the Shafi school, but again, that anything that would knowingly recite it from the Quran for the surahs would be fine in terms of validity. And those are some of the recommended acts, and that if we fulfill that these basic measures and these rulings, then inshallah ta'ala that we have set the foundation for a khutbah that is sound, that in the legal sense. And what remains then inshallah ta'ala is what we will discuss next week. Well, we will look at more that issues related to preparing that for the khutbah. What are the different components that should actually be in the khutbah? Some of the other internal mechanisms that we can bring to heart when we're speaking publicly, and things of that nature. Inshallah ta'ala, we will continue on with that next week, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Are there any questions for?
So Shaykh, is mentioning the hadith in Arabic is one of the arkan or not?
No. It is not required to mention hadith in Arabic, no.
And the khatib, if he can grow the beard, does he have to have a beard?
They don't mention that as an obligation, right, that the khatib has to have a beard. That is considered to be a matter that is not directly related to the khutbah itself, okay? And in general, the vast majority of scholars say that the beard is an obligation, okay? In the Shafi school, there is a difference of opinion. There is an opinion that it's makruh to shave the beard, and that the other opinion is that it's haram to shave the beard. And then that in the Shafi school, there's a discussion of what is considered to be the beard. And in the Shafi school, the dominant opinion is that the beard is that the hair that is on the chin, right? Not including what we would call the sideburns and the hair that goes along the cheekbone. And that I've seen a number of scholars that are great scholars of fiqh that actually shave this part of their beard and just let their, what we would call a goatee, grow. And that's considered to be beard in the Shafi school. That makes scholars of other schools very uncomfortable because of that there are different opinions in other schools, and that some of them consider it even haram to even trim the beard, let alone to shave, right? So we have to look at it holistically and that see it according to all of the different views. And there's no doubt that it's the sunnah of our Prophet ﷺ, and we should appreciate it and love it and deem it to be something beautiful. However, that it's not going to invalidate the khutbah, right? If, say, for instance, it's someone that has a shaved beard. But in general, that along with eloquence and those other things, the people that tend to be more religious are the people that should be, that along with these other considerations, the ones that lead the congregation. So I think that's the balanced way to view that.
Some people also, keep reading word by word from their, whatever the preparation they did. What is your recommendation? I mean, I know in general it doesn't.
So we can talk about that more next week. Yeah, I've always, there are places that just like read a khutbah and the people will read their notes. I've always found that the best khatibs are those that kind of have a general idea of what they're going to say and a basic plan, and allow themselves to take tangents and don't necessarily just read it off the paper. But people have different abilities. If that's just where someone's at, then it might be kind of a first stage, and then they might, when you first start preparing, you kind of over-prepare because you're worried, oh my God, I'm going to forget everything that I'm going to say and that type of thing. And so you have a lot more written down usually. But as you get more and more experience and your knowledge increases, is that you can rely less on your notes. And then you might reach a point, which sometimes happens, where that sometimes you prepare and that have a different thought come to your mind in the beginning and never get to actually what you prepared. And I've had people critique the opposite of that. I've been critiqued before of that someone came up to me after khutbah one time and said, you were all over the place. You should have a topic, that you focus on. And I think that's a fair criticism. And I think that balance is really what we want. I think there should be some continuity in what we say, and and we'll talk a little bit about this next week, these components of a basic structure, but allowing yourself for tangents, but that you can then come back. So there's a consistent flow, and you're getting a message across. And you're combining between theory and practicality and so forth, which we'll get into. I think it's fine if it's in the beginning stage, but we should move towards a basic outline where there's a consistent theme and where we allow ourselves to take basic tangents. Yeah.
So what are the other valid reasons that you can miss the Juma? One is the traveling you said. The other one is if you're sick. If you
Right.
have a work commitment, say I'm a physician, I'm
Yeah.
a patient and I'm taking care of emergency
Right.
and uncalled for emergency,
Right.
or a surgeon,
Yeah.
and how many Jummas you can miss or he can miss. If there's a reason if you're missing.
Right. I mean, for instance, if I look in, this book that I have before you, there's actually quite a few that a'dhar of Juma. And that's really kind of a topic in and of itself. But one of the ones that they mention is that someone that needs to be next to someone, that to take care of them, that is a permissible reason for someone to miss Salat al-Jum'ah, or they mention it in conjunction with the congregational prayer. And so that in that case is that it's not about the number, it's just about if there's a need or not. So if it happens to happen that several weeks in a row, then that's just the case. And so this chapter here, for instance, says أعذار الجمعة والجماعة. These are the excuses that someone can validly miss Juma and the congregational prayer, which the dominant opinion is that it's not an obligation anyway to pray in congregation, and that they mention the following: al-matar, right, rain even. Okay, is that if it's that strong enough to that make their robe or their clothes wet, that for the nighttime if there's intense wind, okay, and so that if someone is extremely hungry, shiddat ju', extremely hungry or extremely thirsty when there's food or drink present, if it's extremely cold or extremely hot, for instance, okay, if there is an earthquake, and so there's actually here 30 different excuses that are mentioned here. So there's a lot, right? And they go on and on, but one of them is here clearly a tamrid, okay, and that is that someone's staying with a sick person to take care of them. And they mention, say, for instance, if it's just your wife, let alone if it's a patient. Now, if there's someone else that you could arrange to be with them, that type of thing, see if that's possible, but in terms of if you're needed to do that, it's one of the very clear that valid excuses, and there's quite a few others. And they mention ishraf al-qarib al-maut, that one of your relatives is close to passing away, okay, and that there's a whole bunch of other reasons as well.
Yeah, small question.
Sure.
So for the adhan, is it necessary to have two adhan? I heard that there used to be one in marketplace.
Right.
To warn people time.
But it's one of the sunnahs of the Khulafa al-Rashideen, right? And even that the adhan is not an obligation, so that even if someone prayed without the adhan, the prayer is still valid, right? It's recommended anyway, the adhan. Right.
The people saying that doing the sunnah while the khutbah has started. I know there's a different fiqh on that.
Mm-hmm. In the Shafi school, that if someone enters into the masjid, or that after the khatib had began, right, as opposed to that if someone enters into a prayer space like where we're at, is that there's no tahiyatul masjid here anyway because it's not technically a masjid. So in that case they would just sit, and they wouldn't be permissible for them to pray the sunnahs before Juma, right, in the Shafi school. But if they enter into a masjid where it's recommended now to do the tahiyatul masjid, the greeting prayer of the masjid, then is that it's permissible to do it in the Shafi school, and it's recommended, rather, but you have to do it with only the integrals. So بأخف يمكن, بأخف يعني, that you have to do it in the lightest way possible and as quick as possible. So you just do the integrals and then you sit down. You don't do that. I'm not sure about the other schools on that particular issue, but that's the Shafi opinion. You can keep going if you have more. Okay.
A somewhat related question to that last one.
Mm-hmm.
Because I didn't exactly follow what you said about the khatib entering the masjid, giving the salams, and then going straight without doing the tahiyyat al-masjid and sitting on the minbar waiting for the second.
Right. So it's recommended, and that's actually a recommended measure we didn't mention. It's recommended. It's not recommended for the imam to be early to Juma. We forgot that, so you can write that in your notes. The imam should come right at the time of prayer, right at the time you're going to begin the sermon. So if it's 1:15, the imam comes right at 1:15 and shouldn't be late. I'm speaking to myself. And then you start. So in that case, if you're in a masjid, that the imam comes right on time, immediately goes up to deliver the sermon. Okay, stands on the pulpit, sends salam, sits down. They call the second adhan, and then he stands up to deliver the sermon. Okay. If, say, for instance, which sometimes could happen, that it's one of the mosques where they do the wa'adh, and then the adhan, and then pray their sunnahs, and then the imam goes up. If the imam enters and he's not going directly up to the minbar, then it's fine for him to pray the tahiyyat al-masjid. Okay, it's what's recommended is what was mentioned, but in that case, let's say you're visiting another mosque and so forth. That's what happens. They take you into the musalla, the masjid early, and then in that case, you would pray the tahiyyat al-masjid, and if everyone else is praying sunnah before Juma and so forth, that as well, and then you stand up. Right? So that's yeah.
And if the imam was saying in an office or another room waiting for the
right,
like
he could do the sunnahs, yeah. Right, exactly.
But he wouldn't come in.
Right, yes, but when he enters, he goes straight up, exactly. Any questions here?
There was one question that said, could you please explain where the bayan style of khutbah comes from? Apparently said to be Hanafi style, prevalent in the majority now.
I think we talked about that, yeah. Sharif, you have a good question?
I was wondering, is the fard amount of people on the onset of the khutbah, like let's say you had 3 people and then someone lost their wudu and left?
That's a good question. Yeah, they have to be there for the integrals. Right, so they have to, the people who are counted for Juma have to hear the integrals. Okay, so if people came late and they didn't hear the integrals, it doesn't count for that number. Yeah. Likewise, if someone leaves, misses an integral and comes back. Khalas? Shall we wrap it up for this week? Tamam? Khair inshallah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us tawfiq in all of our different affairs. Ya Rabb al-Alameen. Allahumma wa ask ya Allah to bless us with the sa'adat al-darain, Ya Arhamar Rahimeen. Allahumma bless us be the elect of those people who perform Juma, Ya Rabb al-Alameen. Expose ourselves to the special sweet breezes of your mercy that you give on that blessed day, Ya Arhamar Rahimeen. Allahumma bless us to be from those people who have ta'aleem for your sha'ar, Ya Arhamar Rahimeen, and have adab in all of our different affairs with your special times and places and special people, Ya Arhamar Rahimeen. Give us tawfiq in all of our different affairs. Forgive us of all of our sins and bless us to always do that which is most pleasing to you in all of our different affairs. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi sallam. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.